Looking at old photographs from the mid-19th century, you get a strange, unsettling feeling. Before us are the grand avenues of St. Petersburg, Moscow, Paris, and other world capitals. The perfectly paved streets, the flawless architecture, the beautifully restored buildings. Everything speaks of greatness and prosperity. It feels as if time has frozen at the peak of civilization. But this perfect picture is disturbed by one frightening detail: the complete and total absence of people. The streets are empty. The squares are silent. The riverbanks are deserted. It feels like we're looking at giant, masterfully crafted movie sets after the film crew has left. The main question that forms in your mind is simple, and at the same time terrifying. Where did all the residents disappear to? There is a simple and, at first glance, logical explanation that is often given by mainstream historians. It comes down to the limitations of early camera technology. The process of taking a picture required a long exposure time, sometimes lasting several minutes. During this time, any moving object, a person, a carriage, an animal, would have moved out of the frame or been blurred beyond recognition. Therefore, only stationary objects like buildings, bridges, and monuments were captured on the photographic plate. This version seems convenient and explains everything, but it crumbles to dust when you take a closer look at city life from that time. After all, the pulse of a big city isn't just about people rushing by. City life is made up of many stationary and slow-moving elements that a long exposure would have been sure to capture. Imagine a bustling market or a shopping street. Even if the customers are moving, the vendors stand at their stalls and counters for hours. Where are they? Where are their goods, laid out on trays, the boxes of provisions, the barrels of drinks? None of this is there. And what about the transportation system? A city could not function without carriage drivers. Their bulky carts and carriages should have been parked at special stands, waiting for passengers. The drivers themselves might have been sitting or dozing nearby, but we don't see a single carriage, not a single cart. Nor are there any horses tied to posts, peacefully chewing hay or drinking water from buckets. These animals could stand in one place for tens of minutes or even hours. Furthermore, city life requires constant maintenance. Firewood and coal were needed to heat homes and cook food. So where are the neat stacks of firewood piled against the walls of houses? Where are the sacks of coal waiting to be unloaded? Where is any other household clutter that is inevitably present in a lived-in space? The streets in the photographs are sterile. The absence of people is just the tip of the iceberg. What's much more frightening is the absence of the very fabric of daily life, its tangible, motionless traces. The cities look as if they were carefully prepared for a photo shoot, with everything extra removed, including the residents themselves and the slightest signs of their activities. This perfect emptiness refutes the theory about flawed camera technology and presents us with a new, much more complex mystery. If the people weren't just missed by the camera, but were actually not there, then what event caused entire megacities to become empty? If the emptiness of the streets is baffling, a closer look at the buildings themselves turns that feeling into real anxiety. Our gaze involuntarily shifts from the deserted streets up to the facades of the buildings, searching for any small hint of a human presence. And it is here, in the details, that an even deeper and darker secret is hidden. The windows, which are called the eyes of a home, look blind and lifeless here. There is no hint of the coziness that daily life creates. We see no soft folds of drapes, no lace curtains, no humble flower in a pot on the windowsill. Those small details that turn a stone box into a home. The window openings gape like dark, empty rectangles, like the eye sockets of an abandoned skull. The same is true for the balconies. These small spaces, extending beyond the apartment, always serve as an extension of the home. People dry laundry on them, put out chairs or rocking chairs for the summer, or store things. The balconies in the old photographs are immaculately clean. They are merely architectural elements, devoid of any function. There are no clotheslines, no furniture, no resident stepping out for a breath of fresh air. The cities don't just look abandoned. They look as if they were never truly lived in. They give the impression of a grandiose model, meticulously assembled by a brilliant architect who forgot to breathe life into it. This is a world of facades, with absolute emptiness hiding behind them. But even these disturbing observations pale in comparison to the most irrefutable and convincing proof of the lifelessness of these cities. You just need to look up even higher, to the roofs. They are dotted with hundreds, thousands of chimneys. The architecture of that time tells us clearly, every house, every apartment was heated individually. Fire was the heart of any home. It was used to cook food and to heat rooms in the cold season. Smoke from a chimney was as essential a sign of life as breath is to a person. It was evidence that a hearth was warm inside the house, that dinner was being cooked, that a family was gathered in warmth and comfort. And here is where we find the main discovery. Not a single puff of smoke is rising from any of these countless chimneys. Not a thin trail, not a thick plume, nothing. The sky above the roofs is perfectly clear. One might assume the pictures were taken on a warm summer day when the stoves weren't lit. But this explanation doesn't hold up. First, food was cooked on fire all year round. Second, the climate in most European capitals is variable, and even summer has its cool days. But most importantly, it's statistically impossible. To imagine that in a city of many thousands, or even millions, every single stove, both for heating and for cooking, was extinguished at the exact same moment, is a scenario from science fiction. It would mean a complete synchronized halt to all life. The absence of smoke is the most eloquent marker. It tells us that the houses are not just empty, they are cold. The cities are not just sleeping, they are frozen in a deep, unnatural, suspended animation, as if their hearts had stopped long ago. Against this backdrop of all-encompassing, cold silence, any sign, no matter how insignificant, that breaks the pattern grabs your attention. And such anomalies, though extremely rare, do exist. They are like a faint light in the darkness, making you doubt for a moment the conclusion that the cities were completely lifeless. Gazing at the monotonous rows of sealed windows, you might suddenly notice on one facade a slightly open transom window. This simple, everyday gesture seems out of place in a dead city. The thought immediately arises, so, there is someone inside. Someone felt stuffy and let some fresh air into the room. This is a tiny, but potentially very important detail, hinting that not all the houses are equally empty. St. Petersburg presents an even more astonishing picture. In some photos, its famous fountains are operating at full power. Powerful jets of water shoot into the sky from the mouths of mythological creatures, sparkling in the sun and crashing noisily into granite bowls. This spectacle itself requires complex engineering support, constant pressure in the pipes, and working machinery. But around this splendor, not a soul. Not a single admiring spectator, not a single strolling couple, not a single child reaching for the cool spray. The beautiful fountains and ancient statues are working in vain, demonstrating their power to an absolutely empty city. This creates a surreal, almost theatrical impression. Finally, we even find a direct contradiction to the idea of cold hearths. On one single photograph, among hundreds of others where the sky above the roofs is crystal clear, you can make out a barely visible, ghostly wisp of smoke rising from a chimney. It is so thin that it could easily be mistaken for a defect on the photographic plate or a scratch. But if we assume it is real smoke, then it becomes the most significant argument that life was, in fact, still flickering in the city. One hearth, one burning fireplace in a vast, frozen metropolis. However, each of these puzzles has a double meaning. These glimmers of hope might just be false leads, guiding us in the wrong direction. An open window. Is it really a sign of presence? Or, on the contrary, is it a trace of a hasty escape when people fled their homes, forgetting such small details? Or perhaps it's part of a sanitation process, where buildings that had been empty for decades were being deliberately aired out before renovation work began? The same goes for the working fountains. Who are they working for? Perhaps not for the residents, who aren't there, but for engineers. This could be a test run, a check of the repaired water supply system, a demonstration of the completed work, captured in a photo for a report, not a scene from daily life. Even the lone wisp of smoke, if it's real, doesn't prove the city is inhabited. It could be smoke from the campfire of a repair crew, or a watchman assigned to guard the empty quarter. A single lit stove against the backdrop of thousands of cold chimneys only emphasizes the overall lifelessness. These rare, ambiguous details are too few to conclude that the cities were populated. Rather, they create an impression of a transitional period, a period of inspection and preparation for something new. When the individual details come together to form a bigger picture, a completely different version of events begins to emerge. The very style of the photographs suggests that their main purpose was not to capture architectural beauty or convey the atmosphere of city life. The composition of the shots often lacks artistic flair. The photographer chooses angles that provide the fullest possible view of the streets, squares, and the condition of the buildings. This looks less like art and more like methodical, almost official documentation. The images feel like a technical record, a visual report intended for careful study. A key element of this report is the perfect condition of the cities. We see not just empty but impeccably clean streets. The pavements are swept, there is no garbage, and the building facades look freshly repaired, or at least brought into perfect order. The window openings, though empty inside, are fitted with new whole panes of glass. There are no broken windows, no dilapidated walls. No signs of the decay that would inevitably appear if a city were abandoned chaotically, and for a long time. On the contrary, everything looks as if a colossal amount of work has been done to restore and prepare it. The cities look as if they have been washed and groomed for an important event. This version explains many of the previously mentioned oddities. The sterile cleanliness, the absence of any trace of daily life, the fountains running in test mode. All of this fits perfectly into the concept of a large-scale inspection. It's likely these photographs were commissioned by some government agency, perhaps for the country's top leadership. The purpose of such a photo shoot could have been to demonstrate the readiness of the megacities for a new phase, resettlement. After some catastrophic event that led to their complete desertion, enough time had passed. Massive restoration work had been carried out, clearing, repairs, replacement of utilities. And now, in the final stage, the result needed to be documented. The photographs served as visual confirmation. The property is ready for occupancy. They were meant to show that the cities were once again habitable. That is precisely why there are no people in them. The residents simply hadn't been moved in yet. They were awaiting a decision that would be made based, in part, on these reports. We are not seeing a living city, but rather a housing stock prepared for settlement. This explains the absence of personal belongings, the perfect order, and the general feeling of an uninhabited yet fully functional space. The pictures captured a unique moment, the pause between the end of a great restoration and the beginning of a great resettlement. But this raises the next, even more fundamental question. What kind of catastrophe could have made it necessary to completely evacuate and then repopulate the largest cities in the world? The search for an answer takes us from the realm of architecture and photography into the grim annals of climate history. Official chronicles record an event known as the Year Without a Summer. It is dated to 1816, and its cause is considered to be the colossal eruption of the volcano Tambora in Indonesia, which spewed a gigantic amount of ash and sulfur into the atmosphere. This suspension, like a giant screen, blocked the Earth from the sun's rays for a long time, causing a sharp and devastating cooling across the entire northern hemisphere. However, if you dig deeper into old European sources and chronicles, you can find mentions that this period of darkness and cold lasted not 1 year, but a full 3 years. 3 years without a proper summer. 3 years without sun. Today, we would call such an event a nuclear winter, and it doesn't really matter what caused it. A volcano, an asteroid impact, or something else. What matters is the fact. The planet was plunged into twilight. Evidence of this global cataclysm is preserved in European archives. They dispassionately record how food prices skyrocketed tenfold, how crop failures followed one after another, causing mass famine and riots. People, fleeing this icy apocalypse, moved en masse to the United States, hoping to find better conditions there. But the same gray sky and cold awaited them there too. This suggests that the phenomenon was truly global, and its icy grip had seized the entire northern hemisphere. And here, the most troubling question arises. What was happening in Russia? It's astonishing, but in official Russian history, there are practically no records of this period. It's as if the vast empire existed in an information vacuum, and the global cataclysm passed it by. Supporters of the traditional view would say, if there were no records, then nothing happened. But logic suggests otherwise. An event of this magnitude could not have had borders. If Europe and America were freezing, then Russia, with its much harsher climate, should have suffered immeasurably more. The absence of records could mean two things. Either there was no one left to record what was happening, or the evidence was so horrifying that it was later deliberately hidden or destroyed. Indirect but very strong evidence of the catastrophic situation in Russia is the direction of migration itself. Why did Europeans flee across the ocean to the USA and not east to Russia, which was much closer? There can be only one answer, because the situation there was even worse. If there was famine in Europe, then in Russia there was likely a complete collapse of the food supply. 3 years without sun for an agrarian country means 3 years of total crop failure. This isn't just a food shortage, it's its complete disappearance. Stockpiles, no matter how large, cannot last forever. The catastrophe that left the cities empty began its countdown not in the streets, but in the frozen fields where the grain never grew. When the fields stopped yielding crops, a merciless countdown mechanism was triggered. The first to feel it were not the people, but the foundation of civilization at that time, the horses. The hay reserves calculated to last until the new grass in June ran out, but summer never came. A horse without feed turns from the main source of power into a burden. One can assume that for a while people tried to feed them with grain from human stocks, but this was only a postponement of the inevitable. Every bag of oats given to a horse was a bag taken from a starving family. Sooner or later the choice was made. The living transportation network, the circulatory system of the empire, was put under the knife to feed its owners. With the disappearance of horses, the last thread connecting the cities to each other was severed. In the capital, St. Petersburg, the authorities could not have been unaware of the scale of the disaster. Imagine a desperate attempt to organize a rescue. Where could they get food from? Only from the south, from those regions where some state grain reserves might have survived. But how to send an order, for example, to Rostov-on-Don? In an era without the telegraph, radio, or internet, the only means of communication was a physical carrier. A courier with a letter, certified with a seal and signature. This person had to travel more than 1,000 kilometers. In normal times, this was a long but feasible task. In the conditions of the new ice age, it became a suicide mission. The roads, if they could still be called that, were buried under a multi-meter layer of snow. Ceaseless blizzards wiped out any landmarks. Even if they could find hardy enough horses and feed for them, they simply couldn't get through. A horse pulling a sleigh cannot move through deep, loose snow. The path must be cleared or packed down. Now imagine thousands of kilometers of roads covered with a 1.5 to 2 meter layer of snow. With what forces could it be cleared? By hand? With shovels? This is absolutely unrealistic. Officially, no special equipment for snow removal existed. Even in our time, in the age of powerful snowblowers and a fossil fuel economy, one heavy snowfall can paralyze a federal highway for weeks. What can be said about that era? Thus, a complete and final transportation collapse occurred. The cities found themselves in a real ice blockade, cut off from the world not by walls and armies, but by an insurmountable force of nature. Any attempts to deliver food from the south were doomed. Caravans, if they were even sent, simply froze on the way, becoming icy monuments to the futility of human efforts. Perhaps some gangs robbed them along the way, because in conditions of universal famine, laws ceased to apply. The delivery of large volumes of cargo in the summer was done by river, but now the rivers were bound by ice of unprecedented thickness. The empire, which had seemed monolithic and powerful, disintegrated into isolated, freezing enclaves. Each city was left alone with its fate, and that fate was terrible. Inside these ice traps, the next most horrific act of the tragedy began. When the cities turned into icy prisons, human nature, stripped of the veneer of civilization, revealed its darkest sides. Hunger is the great equalizer, erasing moral principles and social norms. The first bastion to fall was that of gastronomic decency. What was previously considered inedible or food for the poor became an object of desire. It is in such eras that recipes are born which later, in times of plenty, might be romanticized and called delicacies. Frog legs, snails, cheese covered in thick mold, all these are traces of a desperate struggle for survival, when any source of calories became priceless. All the cats and dogs were eaten. Rats became a coveted prey. But when even this meager food ran out, humanity crossed the final line. Deep in the Paris catacombs, among the neatly stacked bones of millions of people, researchers find gruesome evidence from that era. On some human remains, there are distinct marks left by human teeth. This is silent but eloquent proof that in the agony of hunger, people turned to the most terrible of all possible food sources. In this struggle for life, the social structure completely collapsed. The strong and ruthless formed packs, turning into real gangs. Their targets were food warehouses, the cellars of rich houses, any place where some stock of food might still remain. The city streets became an arena of a silent and brutal war, where the right to life was determined solely by brute force. In this atmosphere of total collapse, those who still had strength made the only right decision: to flee. But not to other cities, which were just the same traps, but away from civilization, into the forests. The forest, which had previously seemed wild and hostile, now became the last refuge and hope for salvation. There one could try to shoot an animal or catch a bird, and most importantly, there was firewood. Trees provided the means to make a fire, to get warm and not freeze to death in this icy world. A mass exodus from the cities began. The young and strong left, leaving behind the elderly, the sick, and the children who were unable to make this arduous journey. The cities rapidly filled with the bodies of those whose lives had come to an end. There was no one to bury them. They remained in their cold apartments, on the snow-covered streets, in public buildings. 3 long dark years passed, and one day the sun returned. The icy grip of winter loosened and the snow began to melt. But this long-awaited warmth brought not salvation, but a new, even more terrible turn in the catastrophe. Thousands of bodies, preserved by the frost, began to decompose. The cities filled with an unbearable stench. Meltwater, mixing with the products of decay, poisoned the wells and springs. Widespread epidemics began. The decaying remains attracted packs of wild animals, which became the new masters of the deserted streets. It became impossible to live in these cities. They had turned into gigantic burial grounds, breeding grounds for infections. Even the few who managed to survive the hunger and cold were forced to stay far away from them. Decades had to pass before nature and time could do their work, and the first attempt could be made to bring these cursed places back to life. Following the physical decay of the cities, the epidemics, and the return to savagery came the most profound and irreversible consequence: the breaking of the great chain of human memory. In any catastrophe, the most vulnerable are the first to go, the elderly and the infants. But in this tragedy, their departure was more than just a statistic. It was a double blow to the very essence of civilization. With the elderly went living memory, the carriers of knowledge, traditions, crafts, family histories, and life experience itself. Every elderly person whose journey ended in a cold house was like a library burned to the ground, taking with them into oblivion unique knowledge that could never be passed on. At the same time, the future was also gone. Children and infants, lacking the immunity and strength to fight the elements, left this world, leaving behind a gaping demographic void. The few children who miraculously survived became a lost generation in the most literal sense of the word. Left without parents, without grandparents, they grew up not knowing their past. Who were they? What was their family name? Who were their ancestors? What was this huge and now frightening city all about? All these questions remained unanswered. Their memory was a blank slate, on which only vague, nightmarish images of cold, hunger, and loss were imprinted. They knew neither the old faith, nor the old laws, nor the old culture. They were the perfect material for forming a new society. You could instill anything in these rootless children. A new history in which there was no terrible winter. A new language cleansed of old concepts. A new country built on the ruins of a world they did not remember. Perhaps it was this phenomenon that gave rise to the precise and chilling Russian expression, Ivan who doesn't remember his kinship. This was not just a figurative insult, but a literal description of an entire generation of people who grew up without a past. It was a social diagnosis given to a society that had suffered from amnesia. The scale of this tragedy was so monstrous that any subsequent government would be interested in consigning it to oblivion. To admit that the great capitals had died out from hunger and cold, that civilization had regressed to cannibalism, was to admit the complete failure of the old world order. It was much easier and politically more expedient to create a new myth. A myth of wild, empty lands that were newly settled and built by wise and strong rulers. History was not just rewritten. It was created anew on the scorched field of collective memory. And in this context, the old unpeopled photographs acquire their true, final meaning. They cease to be just a mystery or a historical curiosity. They become the main, silent witness to that great catastrophe and the great forgetting that followed. They are the only surviving proof, a document from that terrible era that escaped censorship and editorial revision. Looking at these perfectly clean, restored, and absolutely empty cities, we are not just seeing streets without people. We are seeing the last, incorruptible page from a chapter of history that an entire civilization decided to rip out and burn, so that it would never be remembered again.